Good evening and welcome to Aware on the Air, presented by members and friends of Aware, the anti-war, anti-racism effort of Champaign-Urbana, a local peace group. Our program is an hour-long discussion of the wars that the United States government is conducting, literally around the world. Most Americans don't know that President Obama has killed thousands of civilians, including hundreds of children, with his drone strikes alone, and that's only part of his war policy. And that President Obama is lying to us about why the administration is killing people. We had an example this last week in the State of the Union message. The reason is not to stop terrorism. I'm Carl Estabrook. It's February 4th. Our program tonight will include Aware members Ron Szoke on the few, the proud, Karen Evans-Levy on local events, Ron Kester on U.S. government drug dealing, and if there's time, a video from Chris Hedges on the military mind. Aware, our local anti-war group, has been around for 12 years, since the 9/11 attacks, when a number of residents of Champaign-Urbana saw that the U.S. government would use the 9/11 crimes as an excuse to carry on and expand its decades-long wars for control of Middle East energy resources. Control, and not just access to those Mideast oil and gas supplies, has been the cornerstone of U.S. foreign policy since the Second World War, when the U.S. State Department declared them, quote, the world's greatest material prize, close quote. Contrary to what we're told, we in fact import very little of our energy resources, the energy we use at home, from the Mideast, and the amount is declining. Most of our imported oil comes from the Western Hemisphere, notably Canada and Venezuela. But control of worldwide energy flows gives the U.S. government an unparalleled advantage over our economic rivals in Europe and Asia. In short, President Obama is killing men, women, and children around the world in our name because China needs oil, and the U.S. government is determined to control where they get it. This is the real pivot to Asia you've heard about. The president is working for the 1% who profit from arms and oil, not for the vast majority of us. We don't want these murderous wars. 3 out of 4 Americans oppose them, and we don't want to pay for them, but we are. The American people are a problem for Obama. They recently stopped him from bombing Syria. Americans don't want more war and are suffering from the administration's economic policies. But politicians, bankers, and corporations do want war, so it's clear whom Obama is working for. To mislead the U.S. populace, the president says that he's conducting these vastly expensive operations to, quote, stop terrorism and protect civilians. But we can see that instead he's killing civilians and creating terrorists. What we've done is terrible. Over the last 50 years, American presidents have killed, wounded, and made homeless well over 20 million human beings, mostly civilians. That's why the late Martin Luther King called the U.S. government, quote, the greatest purveyor of violence in the world today, close quote. It's still true. President Obama campaigned against that awful record, hope and change, he said, but he was misleading people in order to get elected. Being political, Defense Secretary Robert Gates recently called it. Immediately Obama got into office, he expanded the U.S. Mideast wars. Americans find it hard to admit that he was simply lying to us, that he was going to kill people for the 1%, not end the U.S. wars, but that was indeed the case. Within the first 5 months of Obama's presidency in 2009, he not only sent tens of thousands more U.S. troops to Afghanistan, he also authorized a massive expansion of clandestine military and intelligence operations worldwide. He ordered so-called special forces to be sent into both friendly and hostile nations in the Middle East, Central Asia, and Africa. The deployment of heavily equipped American killers and kidnappers into dozens of new countries was designed, in General Petraeus' words, to, quote, penetrate, disrupt, defeat, or destroy enemies of the U.S. government beyond the rule of law, with no trials or pretenses of accountability. They were also to, quote, prepare the environment for larger attacks from the U.S. and NATO. The Obama administration was not just responding to terrorism. Today, the U.S. Special Operations Command, SOCOM, American Death Squads, consists of more than 70,000 U.S. troops, active in more than 100 countries around the world, according to their own spokesman. These troops are accountable not to Congress, but only to the President's National Security Council. They're a private army, killing people around the world in what is nothing less than the world's greatest terrorist campaign, run out of the White House. No wonder the U.S. is hated around the world. Because of President Obama's intense propaganda and the shameful cooperation of the American media, most Americans don't know the extent of the war that the U.S. has brought to the rest of the world. In our recent anti-war demonstrations in Champaign and Urbana, the most frequently asked questions were, what war? And by those a little better informed, which war? Here we try to explain that. You're watching Aware on the Air, where we try to help frustrate the 1%'s war policy as it's put into practice by the present administration. This week we will hear comments from Ron Szoke on The Few and the Proud, and we'll start with that.
Okay, I'm alluding to an article that appeared recently about how the military services are raising some money on the side by selling licenses to their slogans and symbols, the brand that they carry. Here's one that says, the Marines raise money from their powerful brand. Over its storied 238-year history, the Marine Corps has built a powerful brand. Only in recent years, however, has the Marine Corps and other services been able to capitalize on their reputations by selling agreements that allow businesses to purchase the right to use trademark slogans or emblems on everything from coffee mugs and T-shirts to airsoft guns, which fire plastic pellets. The Marine Corps' reputation and mystique sells particularly well. It's taken 200 years to develop that reputation, said Jonathan Lowe, a co-founder of Predictive Consulting and a branding expert. It's not something you can just create out of whole cloth overnight. Consumers spend about $37 million annually on Marine Corps licensed merchandise, the service said. The Marine Corps has registered a number of phrases, including the iconic "the few, the proud," and "Semper Fi," a Latin phrase meaning always faithful. Even the slogan, "Pain is weakness leaving the body," has been registered by the Marine Corps.
Wow.
The Marine Corps emblem, an eagle, globe, and anchor is also protected. Revenues from royalties remain small, but have expanded dramatically. Revenue from royalty agreements with the Marine Corps amounted to $1.8 million last year, up from $111,000 in 2010. The money goes to a morale, welfare, and recreation fund after paying for operating the trademark program and costs associated with securing registrations. The service has negotiated more than 300 license agreements with companies. The Marine Corps and other services were only able to capitalize on their brands after a passage of a 2004 law that allowed the services to sell trademark licenses to businesses. It took some time to get the licensing business up and running and establishing relationships with businesses. The services screen the requests, ensuring that the emblems or slogans are used in a way that presents the service in a good light. The brands have been popular for a long time, but it was only recently that we could earn revenues from them, said Philip Green, the trademark counsel for the Marine Corps. They've also been aggressive in protecting the emblems and slogans associated with the Marine Corps, ensuring that they are not misused. So they are watching to make sure that the licensing agreements are keeping the value of the brand high, that's being not being misused in a ironic or sarcastic way, I suppose. And they say if they leverage that in the right way, it could be enormously successful, said Stuart Diven, Chief Creative Officer of Red Peak Group, a marketing firm. Anytime a brand has that amount of heritage and is that iconic, businesses want to be associated with it, Devlin said. So what's iconic? for us. Maybe we need a brand here or something so people can go around.
I think you're working on it with your hats.
Yeah,
but I mean,
right.
You know, maybe that's what we need a brand consultant. Huh?
So, coming, T-shirts and coffee mugs with our slogan on it, whatever that is.
Our director, Jason, suggested you were all the village people rolled into one
Right,
today, Ron. So
right.
I guess you're on the way here.
Right. I am large. I contain multitudes. Right. Okay.
Of singing.
Singing
Good heavens.
myself, right.
Marine
Going
showed
on,
us the way.
Message I talked about a bit, I think, last week. There's been an average of one school shooting every other school day so far this year. So there are guns everywhere. And lots of people are now protecting themselves in what I call the micro version of the Bush doctrine. If you feel you are threatened or in danger, you can stand your ground, pull out your gun, and blow them away. And that's being used more and more as a reason for killing people. Another case in the news today in Florida, there was a black teenage guy who was playing the radio of his friend's car too loudly, apparently. So the guy got the white guy, huge white guy, got a pistol from his glove compartment and shot and killed the young man, and claimed that he was standing his ground because he thought he saw the other guy reaching for a gun, shotgun or something. So there you are. Everybody is now standing their ground and defending themselves and taking out, blowing away people that they feel threatened by, or maybe that just make them feel uncomfortable, as they say. So the larger picture here is, I think, the impending war with Iran. Again, we will claim to be defending ourselves from the Iranian atomic bomb.
Yeah, they were reaching for an atomic bomb
Right,
before
right.
we get to shoot
Yeah,
them.
yeah,
Right?
yeah. So this is the macro version of the Bush doctrine. If you feel threatened or uncomfortable or endangered by someone, gun them down, destroy them. Why Israel fears the boycott. This is about the BDS movement, the, what is it, boycott, divest, and sanctions movement. This is in the New York Times, which is not hostile to Israel at all, as you may know. Why Israel fears the boycott by Omar Barghouti. If Secretary of State's attempts to revive talks between Israel and the Palestinian Authority fail because of Israel's continuing destruction of illegal settlements, the Israeli government is likely to face an international boycott on steroids, as Mr. Kerry warned last August. These days, Israel seems terrified by the exponential growth of the Palestinian-led boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement, as it is by Iran's rising clout in the region. Last June, Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu effectively declared BDS a strategic threat, calling it the delegitimization movement. He assigned the overall responsibility for fighting it to his Strategic Affairs Ministry. But this says BDS doesn't pose an existential threat to Israel. It poses a serious challenge to Israel's system of oppression of the Palestinian people, which is the root cause of its growing worldwide isolation. The Israeli government's view of BDS as a strategic threat reveals its heightened anxiety at the movement's recent spread into the mainstream. It also reflects the failure of the Foreign Affairs Ministry's well-endowed Brand Israel campaign, which reduces BDS to an image problem and employs culture as a propaganda tool, sending well-known Israeli figures around the world to show Israel's prettier face. So we hear frequently about a charm offensive by certain foreign ambassadors, representatives, and so on, but we never hear about the charm offensive being carried on by Israel. BDS calls for ending Israel's 1967 occupation, recognizing the fundamental rights of the Arab Palestinian citizens of Israel to full equality and the right of Palestinian refugees to return to the homes and lands from which they were forcibly displaced and dispossessed after 1948. So this was on the January 31st New York Times online, and I invite you to read the whole thing to get the full effect of it. Next, January 31st, Losing the Propaganda War by Hirsch Goodman, who lived for many years in South Africa. And he says, on February 4th, in 1965, as a teenager, I left South Africa, the country of my birth, for a new home in a place I'd never been, Israel. I loved South Africa, but I loathed the apartheid system. In Israel, I saw a fresh start for a people rising from the ashes of the Holocaust, a place of light and justice, as opposed to the darkness and oppression of apartheid South Africa. Now, almost 50 years later, after decades of arguing that Israel is not an apartheid state and that it's an calumny and a lie to say so, I sense that we may be well down the road to being seen as one. That's because in this day and age, brands are more powerful than truth, and inexplicably, blindly, Israel is letting itself be branded as an apartheid state and even encouraging it. So again, he's viewing this as a kind of a public relations problem, while admitting at the same time that there's a good deal in Israel's actual actions with respect to the Palestinian minority and the refugees from Africa that are providing a basis, a grounding for this supposed calumny that's being pronounced against Israel. And in apartheid South Africa, people disappeared in the night without the protection of any legal process and were never heard from again. There was no freedom of speech or expression, and more judicial hangings were reportedly carried out than there were any other place on earth. There was no free press, and until January 1976, no public television. So this goes on to talk about the parallels, but to claim that it's trying to refute the notion that despite all these parallels, Israel should not be considered an apartheid state, even though there are many reasons for saying that. International isolation is potentially more dangerous for Israel than the Iranian nuclear program. The Palestinians and their supporters, particularly the young generation, some of whom have graduated from the best universities in the world, have come to realize that the stones of the first Intifada and the suicide bombers of the second are yesterday's weapons in today's war, which is, of course, is a global propaganda war. Boycott, divestment, and sanctions are now the way they seek to end the Israeli occupation of Jewish Israel itself. Their message has started to resonate with trade unions, churches, universities, and international companies in Europe and the United States who see Israel as oppressing Palestinians and violating their human rights. So this author goes halfway to saying, well, yeah, that's true, but we still must not say, we must denounce and repudiate any notion that Israel is an apartheid state, even though the parallels, the similarities are there. So the latest thing this morning, in the New York Times again, potent pro-Israel group finds its momentum blunted. The last time the nation's most potent pro-Israel lobbying group lost a major showdown with the White House was when President Ronald Reagan agreed to sell AWACS surveillance planes to Saudi Arabia over the group's bitter objections. So the Israel lobby has pretty much had its way with the Congress ever since then. It says, since then, the group, the American Israel Public Affairs Committee, has run up an impressive record of legislative victories in its quest to rally American support for Israel, using a robust network of grassroots supporters and a rich donor base to push a raft of bills through Congress. Typically, they pass by unanimous vote. And of course, everyone's aware that if anyone holds back from this in Congress, the moaning about anti-Semitism will not be far behind. Now, AIPAC, as the group is known, once again finds itself in a very public standoff with the White House. Its top priority, a Senate bill to impose new sanctions on Iran, has stalled after stiff resistance from President Obama and what amounts to a tacit retreat. Excuse me. AIPAC has stopped pressuring Senate Democrats to vote for the bill. Mm-hmm. Officials at the group insist that it never called for an immediate vote and say the legislation may yet pass if Mr. Obama's effort to negotiate a nuclear agreement with Iran fails or if Iran reneges on its interim deal with the West. But for the moment, Mr. Obama has successfully made the case that passing new sanctions against Iran now could scuttle the nuclear talks and put America on the road to another war, which I need not remind you, most Americans do not want another war in the Middle East, particularly when there's no clear exit strategy, and we've never heard about one. Nothing has ever been proposed there, or indeed any mildly plausible plan for getting us out of Iraq and then Afghanistan and now Iran. So this goes on to suggest that the Israel lobby has overreached itself this time, and Congress is generally obedient to their wishes most of the time, maybe 3/4 of the time, but this time they're meeting more resistance and are not going to get their way in passing Senate Bill 1881, which would commit the United States to going to war with Iran, start bombing them whenever Israel, as the phrase goes, feels compelled to attack Iran itself. That would immediately bring the USA into the war, and because the Iranians obviously would try to defend themselves and strike back, and that would be viewed as an attack on Israel, which the USA has long been committed to countering. So there it is. Maybe a war with Iran has been averted for a little while anyway, and we should be grateful for that. So my silly hat today is a battered construction worker's hat. Not exactly hard because it's always dented, but my excuse this time is I'm working to construct a better world, and this stuff is my way of doing it. Carl?
Thank you, Ron. There are a lot of important things there. First of all, the article, the Times article from the South African, who compares South African apartheid pre-Mandela to Israeli apartheid, it seems to me is substantially misleading and is meant to be misleading. Apartheid in Israel today, which means the distinction between Jews and Palestinians within the area controlled by Israel. Remember, Israel has no determined boundaries. The boundaries are a matter of effective enforcement, not of law. The apartheid, the separation of Jews and Palestinians within those boundaries, such as they are, is greater than it was in South Africa. Israeli apartheid is harsher than South African apartheid was. And the clearest example of that is that under the apartheid system in South Africa, the non-white citizens of South Africa were assigned to Bantustans, as they were called. That is, countries for the Bantu. These were areas within South Africa that were designated as the homelands of the non-white citizens of South Africa. Now, in order to make this fiction run, fiction was necessary because the folks who were assigned to the bento stands were the ones who were the working class of South Africa in the mines and elsewhere. The notion was they may be working in a mine in some other part of South Africa, but they really come from a Bantustan in the east of the country or something. In order to make this fiction at all plausible, the South African government actually had to support those Bantustans, housing, food, various and sundry other ways in which it had to look like they were viable communities, viable economies. The Israeli government has no such responsibility for the areas in the West Bank and Gaza that they are illegally occupying and in which they are settling. The only people, of course, who are supported by the Israeli state in this area are those illegal settlers. So in this sense, the apartheid system in in Israel now is harsher than the apartheid system in South Africa, and of course there are other differences as well. I think what we need to realize sometimes, though, is another aspect of American policy regarding Israel. There is a conviction on both the left and the right in American politics that Israel and its American lobby, specifically AIPAC, but other institutions as well, exercise an undue influence on the American government and on American policy in the Middle East. There may be some truth in that. There are an awful lot of lobbies, after all, that exercise influence on the American government. But AIPAC is just one of a set of lobbies, and one might argue that they're nowhere near so powerful as, say, the defense industry lobby, or even the oil lobby, and so forth. And I think in order to combat this notion that the American government is simply at the beck and call of the Israeli government, we should look at the history. It certainly was not the case that it was the last time in which the Israeli government was told to do something different from what it had in mind was in the Reagan administration. I mean, there are plenty other examples, too, from later administrations where the U.S. government has even publicly rejected a policy undertaken by the government of Israel. Now, it's important, I think, to look at the general strategy that the U.S. is following in the Middle East. The U.S. Activates the principle from 19th century British diplomacy of no permanent friends, no permanent enemies, only permanent interests. And so we've had various diplomatic revolutions in the history of the U.S. involvement in the Middle East. In fact, the U.S. adoption of Israel as its principal client in the Middle East, which didn't occur until after the 1967 war, represented one of these changes. And it was not absolutely clear that was going to happen. The U.S. today has two principal clients in the Middle East. Those are Israel and Saudi Arabia. And Israel and Saudi Arabia, as a result, are in an unlikely alliance in terms of implementing American policy, American imperial control of the Middle East. Now, both clients can get restive at various points, and both have been restive recently because it's become clear that the American policy is not exactly support for everything Saudi Arabia and Israel want, specifically in the example that Ron has described, and the fact that both these countries are rivals for regional influence with Iran, and want the U.S. to take a much harsher line against Iran. The U.S., with its long-term goal of controlling Middle East energy flows, is still looking for an arrangement with Iran that would involve some sort of control of those energy flows, and that's what the Secretary of State is busily doing in the Middle East at the moment. And he's being constantly pilloried by the Israeli government and press because of the fact they recognize that he is pursuing American strategy. He's following the American policies, which are not precisely the Israeli policies. So there's a lot to this, and I think that Ron is right to stress the defeat of Senate Bill 1881 that provides for war with Iran, the effective defeat. I mean, was not defeated by a vote. And we should note, indeed, that our own junior senator in Illinois, Mark Kirk, was one of the principal movers of this bill, and he should be properly reprimanded for it, and I hope we'll understand this as a serious defeat. His senior colleague, I must say, Senator Durbin, who is high in the councils of the Democratic Party, was noticeably quiet about S 1881, and only when the smoke cleared, so to speak, and it became clear the administration was going to be able to prevent a vote on the bill, did Durbin suggest at all, or even come close to suggesting that that was the best idea. You're watching Aware on the Air. We have a good deal of other business to consider. In fact, the thing that struck me most this week was the great curtain of propaganda being drawn apart across the real economic and military policies of the American government. The American government really finally only has one enemy that it's afraid of, and that enemy is the American people. We saw that most recently with the inability of the Obama government to get the Obama administration to get its attack on Syria going. That fell apart because of the opposition of the American people. We nevertheless see many examples of the way in which the American government and the people it's working for mislead the American public so that the policies can be kept in place. The story of the Iranian bomb is only the most notable example these days. This last week there were two well-publicized events that showed how those in power in the American 1% are purposely misleading us about the urgent problems faced by the United States and the world. And those two events were the State of the Union message and the World Economic Forum in Davos, which Ron memorably described last week as Swiss cheese, full of holes, and I think that was a worthwhile bit of branding. In the excellent Black Agenda report, which I recommend to you, it can be found on the web and also broadcast in some places, Glenn Ford called the State of the Union a, quote, festival of lies. The annual event is used to masquerade drivel as accomplishment and reinforce the notion that a collapsing society is a thriving democracy, close quote. Americans seemed tired with this annual show. It had the lowest number of viewers, it was a week ago tonight, lowest number of viewers since 2000. Unlike the Super Bowl, they did not raise their viewership. President Obama out-Orwelled Orwell from his false rosy picture of the economy by saying that fracked gas is good for the environment, up to and including his glorification of war. Obama's State of the Union was an exercise in presenting a false reality. The speech could have been given by a robot or an actor or a media spokesman. And Obama may be at least two of those. The fraudulent peace process in Syria seemed more designed to lay the groundwork for war, an Orwellian subterfuge. And then there's the hypocrisy of our 10-year, trillion-dollar commitment to upgrading U.S. nuclear weapons while opposing the non-existent threat of Iran developing a bomb. Obama and his allies have finally discovered income inequality, though. Of course, most of us have been aware of it for some time now. The wealth divide was a root cause of the revolt known as Occupy, and 2/3 of Americans recently told Gallup they were dissatisfied with the way wealth is distributed in the United States. During this presidency, poverty is at record high numbers. 95% of the gains in productivity during the so-called recovery had gone to the top 1%. The president's focus on income inequality was an admission of the failure of his policies. While President Obama acknowledged the wealth divide, he failed to put forward policies that really address it. The real state of the economy is long-term stagnation and decay. When that reality is faced, then totally different solutions are needed. solutions that would really challenge the present system of big finance capitalism. We need economic democracy, where people have more participation in making economic decisions and greater benefit for the economy. We need a truly progressive tax system, we need to allow workers to create unions and to reverse trade policies that favor transnational corporations. The one real policy President Obama put forward was to raise the pay of low-wage workers under federal contracts. The federal government is the biggest employer of poverty workers in the U.S., not McDonald's, as you may have heard. President Obama promised a $10.10 minimum wage. Workers won this concession through a series of one-day strikes that targeted the Obama administration. But the promise sounds even less impressive when you get to the details. The change only affects new contracts. So instead of 2 million workers getting an immediate raise, those federal workers, only 200,000 will. What a State of the Union message would look like if indeed the economy were ruled popularly. Current polls show supermajorities of Americans favoring a very different direction for the economy and government. People put job creation as the top priority. But of course, the administration doesn't want to do this because employers know that a serious program of job creation, like the WPA, the Works Progress Administration during the New Deal, would necessarily raise the wages those employers would have to pay to other workers. If other workers can say, I can get a job at a living wage from the federal government, I don't need to take this job at far less than a living wage that you're offering. And that would be unfortunate for Walmart, Target, and many other employers in the U.S. The world's 85 wealthiest people, we found out this last week, have as much money as the 3.5 billion poorest people on the planet, half the world's population. People are coming to notice this, and the fact that people are noticing forced the issue onto the agenda at the World Economic Forum in Davos, Switzerland. We should not fall for the glossy veneer of Davos, but recognize it's a stage for multinational corporations, among them human rights abusers, political racketeers, property thieves, and international environmental criminals. These are not people who deserve applause. They deserve fierce resistance, as they are the instruments of the economic and environmental problems the world faces. Fewer than 1% of corporations in the world control 40% of global business. 37 of the world's largest economies are not countries at all, but companies. Now, in this situation, we're not talking about a little group of evil men. We're not talking about a few villains who can be replaced and everything will be wonderful. We're talking about a system of economic control, a system which is anti-democratic and is meant to be anti-democratic because a system of this sort makes more money for the 1%. Unfortunately, the system is having repercussions around the world. The collapse of the Argentine peso and the Turkish lira, the Russian ruble even, and South Africa's rand are taking a nosedive to their lowest levels since 2008, and the Brazilian real is falling to its lowest level in half a year. This is compounded by a slump in the Chinese economy, the shrinking of the U.S. Federal Reserve's quantitative easing program, and pressures on other markets around the world. All of these suggest the possibility of a new phase of the economic crisis rather than the crisis coming to an end, as President Obama advertised in the State of the Union speech. The political and economic elite are putting forth the same policies that contributed to the economic collapse. The top global example of this is the continued push for rigged corporate trade agreements, falsely called free trade agreements, deals that have been a major cause of wealth inequality by pushing down wages and providing access to cheap resources which make the wealthiest wealthier. More rigged corporate trade will actually expand the wealth divide, not shrink it. It's not only the fact that President Obama and not only the facts that President Obama and the global trade activists ignore, but also the politics. The president's political base has come out to protest the controversial corporate trade agreements like the Trans-Pacific Partnership, and now there's opposition in the Republican activist base as well. They have dubbed the free trade agreements Obama trade. That's not praise. Now, we should be impressed, I think, by the fact that there is opposition both within the Democratic and Republican parties, if you like, to this trade program, specifically to what's called fast track. That is the arrangement in the Congress that these trade programs should be approved without debate or amendment in the Congress. This apparently has failed, and this is a victory that in its way is perhaps at least as significant as the repeal of the Iran sanctions bill or the failure of the Iran sanctions bill in the Congress. These are good signs of the rejection of the economic and military policies of the Obama administration. The story of the TPP, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, and the efforts to pass fast-track Trade Promotion Authority is also one that illustrates why the power structure fears the people. Politicians and the corporate media did their best to keep people ignorant about the TPP, the Trans-Pacific Partnership. For the first 2 years of negotiations by President Obama, they were effective. They did that effectively. But in the last 2 years, there's been a rising tide of awareness and opposition to this arrangement. Numerous articles have exposed the TPP in the independent media, and WikiLeaks leaked sections of the secret agreement that was so secret it wasn't even shared with members of Congress. Now a movement of movements, that is, these various groups, not the traditional left-right divide at all in American politics, has come together to oppose fast track and the so-called free trade agreements. The results: people are defeating transnational corporations and their lackeys in elected office. The success is quite amazing, as the TPP seemed unstoppable less than a year ago. But with awareness came mobilization. Unless something changes dramatically, fast track and the TPP look dead for now, as does the Iran sanctions bill. There's always a disparity between what we're told by the government and the corporate media and reality. Our job is to try to understand and describe that reality. Those in power greatly fear people who leak documents that show the truth beyond any doubt. It's become safe to leak while remaining anonymous, thanks to outlets like WikiLeaks. The reaction to Snowden's leaks show the power one person who tells the truth can have in a nation dominated by lies. That's why the administration is so scared of it. And 2 signal defeats in recent weeks seems to suggest they should be afraid. Comments, Ron?
No, it raises for me the question of the value of the American political system, where we're expected to conform to the notion that there are 2 opposing political parties, and ignoring the ever more obvious fact that we're going to get substantially the same policies no matter who we vote for. And if we think we're going to get better policies by voting for one party that will throw the other party's rascals out, I'm afraid that's not really going to happen.
Yeah.
On my hard hat, I have a little "I voted" sticker, despite the studies tending to show by an input or output or cost-benefit analysis that voting is futile. It's unnecessary use of resources that will not change the outcome by doing that. I continue to vote myself in the hope that someday, somewhere, it will start to make a difference, and it will stimulate some policies that are contrary to the war-making and ever greater armaments policies of our own government. But I'm not sure that's going to happen. What we need is a new public philosophy, a civic culture that looks at this and says, on the basis of something like Prisoner's Dilemma, that if everyone looks at voting from the standpoint of what's in it for me, nothing will happen because there's not much in it for any individual. But if we become convinced, cultivating a civic culture of the common good, that as the phrase goes, when everyone does better, then everyone does better, and what goes around comes around and all that, then we can break out of this and get people to see that it is to their personal advantage also to participate in the civic culture, the debates, and of an informed citizenship. But I think all the signs are against that now. It's very discouraging. So I'll continue to wear my battered pseudo hard hat and hope that something better will turn up.
I think we've changed roles somewhat this week, Ron. Yeah. You're usually the encouraged one. I'm usually the discouraged one. Yeah. And here I am celebrating the fact that with two substantial victories, in spite of the mass misleading from the State of the Union address and the Davos events in Switzerland, two major victories in this last week. Admittedly fairly defensive victories, but victories nonetheless. I'm referring to the defeat of the effective defeat of the Iran sanctions bill, the Iran war bill that you described earlier, and the apparent defeat of the fast track authority that would produce the TPP free trade bill. Now, admittedly, these are both defensive actions, but the important point, as I think is the point you started with, that they were opposed not by the traditional divisions in American politics, left, right, Republican, Democrat, and so forth. They were opposed by popular groups in both parties, popular groups on both the left and the right. In each case, that is the war bill and the Trans-Pacific Partnership, have major movements, popular movements of people from these various political positions coming together and saying that this shall not stand. This is heartening.
Well,
this is heartening indeed.
I would point out that they've not really been defeated. They've only been postponed.
Well, that's a very good point, and that is the fact that they represent essential parts of the major policy that this administration is putting forward, as earlier administrations did, at the behest of the 1%. But hey, look, I mean, a victory's a victory, right? Yeah. I mean, we've got something to build on here, just the way you're talking about. Yeah. So, hey, buck up, man. You've been watching Aware on the Air, where Pollyanna is in charge. It's presented by members and friends of the anti-war, anti-racism effort of Champaign-Urbana, a local peace group, in the 6th week of 2014. Our thanks to our director and producer, Jason Liggett. We also want to remind you of other programs like ours here on UPTV, now streaming online at urbanapublictelevision.org. Weekdays, Monday to Friday, Democracy Now! At 7 a.m., which had horrifying stories this morning of these corrupt judges in Pennsylvania. That can be found online, too. If you missed it here at UPTV, look for it online. The Big Picture at Tom Hartman every weekday morning at 8 a.m. and Democracy Now! Repeated at 5 p.m. in the evening, a rebroadcast of the morning's program. Now, if you object to the Obama administration conducting illegal and unjustified war and lying about the reasons for it, you can join us. Aware meets every Sunday evening, 5 to 6 p.m. at the White Horse Inn on John Street in Champaign near the UC campus. We discuss the war and plan activities like the following: street demonstrations. For more than a decade, AWARE has conducted demonstrations and distributed information about the war. They now occur on the first Saturday of every month, 2 to 4 p.m. at Main and Neal Streets in downtown Champaign. And it was cold out there last Saturday, but there were people nobly in place, and I went home early. I'm old. But the fact of the matter is that AWARE continues to hold these demonstrations. All are welcome to join us. Information tables, something else AWARE does at the Urbana Farmers Market and other public events, like the holiday markets, what do they call
Now it's
them?
called Middle Market.
Middle markets
Next
now.
one is on February 15th.
February 15th in Lincoln Square. AWARE has tables with free printed information on the war, books, T-shirts, buttons, bumper stickers, things like that. We do television programs like the one you're watching. The program is recorded unrehearsed at noon on Tuesdays in the UPTV studios. Members and friends of AWARE are invited to attend and participate in this discussion. Articles in the local media, letters to the editor in Champaign-Urbana News-Gazette, and even the Daily Illini are one of the few ways to join a general political discussion locally. It's interesting that there aren't too many other ways. Demands to elected representatives. People in Champaign-Urbana are represented in Congress by Senators Dick Durbin and Mark Kirk, whom we've already mentioned as one of the leaders in the Iran war bill, and by Representative Rodney Davis, who also supported it, by the way. All three support the administration's wars and assassinations and are, in fact, urging Obama to expand the killing. You can register your opinion by calling in our Washington, D.C. offices, which can be reached at 202-224-3121. That phone number connects you with the main switchboard in the Capitol, and you can say where you're from and which senator or representative you want to talk to. That's area code 202-224-3121. And you should say you're calling from Illinois' 13th Congressional District. AWARE has an internet presence. We conduct 2 email mailing lists, which you can join on the website. Go to listchampana.net. We conduct these mailing lists for announcements and for discussions of the war. And you can also see our Facebook page under the name AWARE. Members and friends of AWARE are also invited to sit on this panel and participate on AWARE on the Air. Finally, AWARE honors those who reveal the crimes of the U.S. government, which the rest of the world knows about, but Americans don't. Manning, Assange, Snowden, and the others who are being persecuted by the Obama administration. Now, this is Carl Estabrook for Karen Aram, Ron Szoke, Karen Evans-Levy, Stuart Levy, David Johnson, and other members and friends of AWARE, saying in the words of the late Edward Murrow, good night and good luck.